There's a persistent misconception among executives that a macroeconomic recession acts as a universal demand shock. The assumption is that the tide recedes and lowers all ships evenly, and that a shrinking market wipes everyone out across an industry. Looking closely at the historical data from the dot-com bust in 2001 and the Great Recession in 2008 reveals a completely different reality. This Bain & Company analysis tracks 3,500 companies. Heading into the global financial crisis, the paths violently split. For unprepared firms, growth flatlines, averaging a mere 4% rate. But the top 10% of prepared companies accelerate, soaring to a 17% growth rate. That is a 13% performance gap between the winners and the losers, and it persists for more than a decade after the initial shock. The question is, what structural choices dictate which side of this divide a firm lands on? The empirical data points to three operational pillars: capital structure, organizational design, and how a company manages its labor and technology. A downturn doesn't create this performance gap, it exposes prior structural preparation. It acts as a massive wealth transfer from the rigid to the agile. Strategy requires options, and options require cash. The balance sheet is the hard constraint on any crisis survival playbook. An MIT study of the Great Recession mapped business closures directly to dropping consumer demand in local counties. But the demand drop alone wasn't the fatal blow. It was demand dropping combined with specific levels of debt. The companies that failed because of falling demand carried an average debt-to-asset ratio of 38.3%. Firms that had actively deleveraged heading into the recession sat at roughly half that, at 19.5%. Leverage functions as a mechanical trap. As incoming revenue shrinks, fixed debt payments remain static. Interest and principal consume an ever-increasing share of whatever capital is left in the business. To keep up with those mandatory payments, highly leveraged companies are forced to eliminate capital expenditures and abandon strategic investments. Those budgets entirely disappear. The alternative is aggressive working capital management and early deleveraging, executed before the broader market even recognizes the downturn. Reducing excess inventory and tightening customer trade credit act as internal shock absorbers. They free up cash from within the company's own operations, bypassing the need to secure outside lending when credit markets freeze. Excessive debt removes a leadership team's agency. It forces reactive, survival-based cuts, exactly when the opportunity cost to make strategic moves is at its lowest. Financial structure only dictates if a company survives the initial shock. Organizational design dictates how a company processes the ensuing uncertainty. The standard executive reflex during a crisis is to hoard decision-making power and centralize control. Information is pushed up the chain, creating a severe bottleneck. But researchers analyzing world management survey data for manufacturers during the 2008 recession found this instinct is mathematically incorrect. When comparing highly centralized firms against a decentralized, independently pulsing web of local managers, the decentralized firms weathered the macroeconomic shocks significantly better. Because recessions introduce intense turbulence, the value of local, real-time information increases exponentially. A local plant manager on the ground can identify a shift in customer demand and adjust their specific product mix far faster than a corporate headquarters can collect the data, debate it, and issue a mandate. Decentralization does not predict the future. It mitigates uncertainty by matching decision rights directly with localized expertise, preserving operational speed when the environment changes daily. This brings us to the most common, deeply flawed defensive reflex of all, the mass layoff. Severing headcount provides an immediate balance sheet illusion, but it carries massive hidden costs. It destroys morale, drags down remaining productivity, and guarantees expensive rehiring and retraining premiums when demand inevitably returns. Compare this to Honeywell in 2008. Instead of blunt cuts, they utilized localized furloughs and short-time work programs to manage labor costs. Data from the Center for Economic Policy Research confirms this approach works. Companies using short-time work programs preserve jobs, survive at higher rates, and maintain operational readiness. Preserving that baseline human capability allows a firm to transition from defense to offense, and the primary offensive weapon is technology. This chart shows the mechanics of counter-cyclical IT investment. During an economic boom, the opportunity cost of taking production systems offline to upgrade is incredibly high. During a recessionary demand lull, that cost drops to near zero. technology is actually cheaper to implement during a recession. A study by the Upjohn Institute observed exactly this behavior. In the U.S. cities hit hardest by the Great Recession, prepared firms actively spiked their digital and IT investments. This buys permanent structural advantages. Advanced analytics and agile software create immediate flexibility around product volume changes and supply chain routing. A fortified balance sheet and operational structure also open the door for acquisitions. Historically, mergers executed during a downturn generate 15% higher shareholder returns than boom-time deals. Retaining human capital and aggressively adopting IT when implementation costs are lowest creates a mathematical advantage. It reliably widens the performance gap against competitors who are paralyzed by layoffs. Let's bring this back to the data. This divergence from 2003 to 2015 isn't an accident. The bottom line represents firms that relied on highly leveraged balance sheets, centralized decision-making in a panic, executed mass layoffs, and froze capital investments. The top line represents firms that deleveraged early, pushed authority outward to decentralized nodes, retained their labor readiness, and spent aggressively on IT capital expenditures. Executing this playbook requires leaders to overcome their own human psychology and instincts. When a crisis hits, the reflex is to fall into cause-oriented thinking, obsessing over who is to blame or why the market failed. Survivors force a shift to response-oriented execution. They filter the chaos through 4 specific lenses: control, impact, breadth, and duration. Instead of panicking over broad, uncontainable macroeconomic forces, they isolate the specific variables they can directly control and impact right now. Rather than bracing for indefinite damage, they define the breadth of the crisis to actively identify the hidden operational upside within their industry. Recessions do not pause the game, they reset the board. While inaction is fatal, reflexive contraction is a slow death. True resilience requires using the macroeconomic shock as an offensive weapon.